super weird. So is the proceeding came out, or maybe still? Do you think the conference proceedings might not come out yet?
Have they commenced?
Yeah, proceedings. The conference proceedings. Did it come out, or maybe not yet? The paper, yeah.
I don't today. No. They'll we'll get to see our own videos. Like it'll.
All right, but just like paper, because usually proceedings usually come out before the conferences, but I didn't receive any email for that, so not sure if the paper came out. Glad you meet you virtually. Hope you are staying well during this very, very difficult time. My name is Sojung Bahng. I'm an artist and researcher at Sentience at Monash University, Melbourne, Australia. I'm presenting the paper, Sleeping Eyes, via narcolepsy storytelling through the duality of presence, developed with my co-authors, Nina Lashik, Ella Wilson, and John McCormick from Sensi Lab, and independent artist Sungeun Lee. Today, I'm going to talk about an interactive cinematic VR piece titled Sleeping Eyes, produced at Sensi Lab and developed as part of my practice-based PhD research. In this video, I'll focus mainly on explaining our creative project, Sleeping Eyes. Please refer to our paper for the background research for this project. Sleeping Eyes developed as a collaborative project with a South Korean media artist, Sungeun Lee, who has been diagnosed with narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is a neurological disorder that makes people fall asleep uncontrollably. We use VR as an artistic medium to represent some symptoms of narcolepsy and provoke reflections on the boundaries between dream and reality. The development of Sleeping Eyes was undertaken as a 1.5-year collaborative process. I first met Sungeun in 2018 at a media art residency program in South Korea. During the conversation with him, he confided in me that he was narcoleptic. At the time, I must confess that I did not even know what narcolepsy was. In South Korea, issues dealing with narcolepsy are not well recognized, and I felt very sorry and ashamed of my ignorance. Based on our conversations, we decided to create a VR work about his condition as a collaborative project. Based on my conversation with Sungeun, I found that his difficulties as a narcoleptic person were not simply about falling asleep uncontrollably. He had suffered more from his confused or foggy states between dream and reality. I also realized that his main traumatic experiences came from social violence in school and later in the army, based on the ignorance of his peers about narcolepsy, not from the condition itself. He did not realize that he was narcoleptic until he joined the military for 2 years of service, as most South Korean men are required to do. Especially in high school and in the army, he experienced a great deal of physical and mental violence and social oppression. His memories of violence were often represented in his dreams, and he experienced considerable fear in these dreams. Sungeun and I decided to represent his dreams from when he was in high school and in the army using VR. We co-created the story, and then I made the 3D environments and characters inspired by Sungeun's drawings. The collaborative process was challenging. Although I tried to understand his narcoleptic symptoms by doing a lot of research about narcolepsy, it was not something I could clearly grasp. The process of creating this project brought to the surface fundamental questions about the limitation of empathy toward others. Many people have argued that VR is an effective tool for creating empathy. However, I contest that eliciting empathy is not so easy. It is much more nuanced and complicated. We can't simply simulate other people's lives and share their perspectives using VR. The other is inherently transcendental. We can't easily encounter or understand the concrete other. As Levinas claimed, we should accept the fundamental differences between us and try not to reduce otherness to sameness. I accepted the fact that Sungeun needs to remain an otherness to me. At certain points, I decided not to simulate his inner world or attempt to represent his narcolepsy. Rather, I decided to be a mediator, instead revealing common social perceptions and ignorance about narcolepsy. The artwork is in an intersubjective positioning between Sungeun and me. In VR, people occupy physical and virtual spaces simultaneously. As a person with narcolepsy, Sungeun is confused about whether he's in a dream or in a reality. When Sungeun describes his worldview, he often talks about quantum mechanical states, such as underdetermined, constantly shifting between states of consciousness with little control. We create a story by using the metaphor of quantum mechanical concepts. Nina Lasher, a physicist and co-author of this paper, advised on the story design in order to accurately convey quantum mechanical concepts as metaphors through the story. In Sleeping Eyes, nonlinear narrative and gamification techniques were applied to allow viewers to actively explore the story. We also utilized a heart rate sensor to convey the viewer's stress states and make them aware of their own feelings about the artwork as they are experiencing it. The experience lasts approximately 8 to 12 minutes, depending on the viewer's interaction. The story begins with the viewer finding themselves in a dark classroom containing a desk with several objects that identify Sungeun. There is a virtual hand, and Sungeun's narration is triggered when you grab certain objects, such as medicine or the photo of a school. Once you have heard all the informative narrations about Sungeun, the scene changes to a high school.
Even in unexpected situations.
A teacher is giving a lesson about quantum mechanics and Schrödinger's cat. We used a mix of game-like and rocky or cracked aesthetics to play with the tension between familiarity and unfamiliarity, as well as physicality and non-physicality.
You, are you dozing off again? Today we will learn about a famous thought experiment in quantum mechanics, Schrödinger's cat.
A biofeedback sensor was also used to make the viewer aware of their physical engagement in the artwork. The viewer's heart rate variability, HRV, is mapped to the visual change in the artwork. Elliot Wilson, who has a technical background in game development, created custom software to connect the heart rate sensor to a PC and to forward the data to the Unity game engine that was used to create a work. For example, high HRV could be associated with better emotional regulation, so we assumed that low HRV could be mapped to Sungeun's confused and foggy states. The viewer's HRV was mapped to the level of situation and vividness of the virtual environment.
One of you will walk into a room. Any volunteers?
Based on the idea of Schrödinger's cat, the teacher asked the students to participate in an experiment involving two doors. The viewer must enter one of the rooms and avoid the lasers that come from students' eyes. Otherwise, the teacher becomes violent and the door is blocked. This created a sense of playfulness and suspense that further immersed them in the virtual story. One door leads back to the schools, but the other is connected to an army watchtower. In the watchtower, Sungeun's body appears dressed as a soldier. An army superior threatens him because he fell asleep. We designed multiple virtual representations of the viewer's own body to signify levels of unconsciousness and a dream state, drifting between embodiment and disembodiment. Also, the viewer's heart rate, or pulse, is synchronized with the flickering light and the beating sound. Suddenly, he falls from the watchtower, but then arrives at the school and becomes one of the students who was watching him earlier. He again falls asleep and wakes up in a hospital bed. There are two possible endings. In one, Sungeun is wearing a school uniform, but his army superior is walking into the hospital. In the other, he is instead wearing a military uniform, but his teacher is walking into the hospital. One of these two endings is randomly selected for the viewer.
Are you dreaming?
In conclusion, Sleeping Eyes exploit the duality of presence and embodiment to allow people to become physically aware of the experience of Sungeun with narcolepsy, and to prompt questions about the boundaries between dream and reality, along with the boundaries between virtual and physical worlds. If you are interested in experiencing Sleeping Eyes, please contact me. Thanks for watching the video. Take care. Bye. See you later.
Hello, my name is Jane Tingley, and I am an artist and curator and assistant professor at York University in Toronto.
And I'm Cindy Poremba. I'm an experimental video game designer and associate professor at OCAD University in Toronto. Not here with us today is our third collaborator, software engineer Marius Kintel, who's the primary author of OpenSCAD. We're here to talk a little bit about the anyWare project as an exploration of mediated sentience through play, and as a model for envisioning network communication in a more inclusive and more embodied way.
anyWare is comprised of 3 identical distributed sculptures that were designed to explore different forms of embodiment as it relates to interaction, experience, and play. Specifically, we were interested in using telematic technologies because we wanted to explore contemporary experience and its hybrid nature, being both digital and physical. So just to contextualize what we mean by telematics, basically we're talking about distal communication technologies and strategies. So from the telegraph to satellite communication to most recently Zoom, as I'm sure you're all aware of due to having to go online because of the pandemic. So I guess now more than ever, we become painfully aware of the limitations of our current technological landscape. Technologies generally are developed in service of industry and address the needs of those who create them. Interfaces are designed for teleconferencing, online collaboration, word processing, etc. They're often without poetry nor ambiguity. However, as technologies get smaller and less expensive, they get democratized, and as a result, they wiggle their ways into our lives and therefore into our intimate moments. We not only think through them, but we begin to feel through them. We feel love, loss, happiness, sadness, anger. But how do we hug each other through Zoom when we really actually just need this? The fact is, we speak to our children living in different parts of the world. We love our lovers in long distance relationships. And during COVID-19, we connect with friends and grandparents who are desperately needing human connection. Well, obviously this is a huge question, but at its very core, anyWare wanted to rethink ways of touching each other through technology. The project asked the question, how can we rethink our interfaces and find new ways of engaging with each other over distances?
Now, games are one of our oldest and most refined interactive forms. A game like hopscotch dates back to around 1000 BCE and spans multiple cultural contexts. Games can create compelling, often longer durational multi-user engagements, in part by reinscribing the social context, playfully redefining the grammars and rules of our encounters. And we believe that we can design better interactive experiences by learning from how they do this. Creating new grammars for interaction solves some issues. For example, this can help people understand a new social context. And in the case of games, encourage them to approach it more openly and playfully. But it also creates others, particularly if you're starting from scratch or near scratch with people who are perhaps less familiar with games and how they work and how they're structured. We didn't want people interacting with anyWare to have to focus on learning how to interact. We wanted that to be as transparent as possible, to focus instead on the experience of connection. Arcade and playground games, simple games that are familiar and easy to learn, have proven particularly useful in this regard, as they're designed to teach you their basic rules as quickly as possible, and to allow for varying levels of comfort, familiarity, and engagement, including spectatorial engagement. But we don't typically design for embodied play in network or remote contexts, those two things together. We do see interesting examples of embodied play, particularly in independent and art games. One example actually is a game that Jane worked on called Propinquity by Lynn Hughes and Bart Simon. There are even a few examples of network games that don't prioritize verbal communication or try to incorporate that kind of communication in any real way. Journey by that game company is one example. The Endless Forest by Tale of Tales would be another one. So there are some models of how we might use these kinds of interactions within something like anyWare.
So when we began working on anyWare, we started with 3 sort of probes: how to find ways to communicate and play non-verbally, how to facilitate embodied interaction through technology, and how to develop new interfaces that encourage a type of engagement that does not rely heavily on voice and vision. As a starting point to introduce you to anyWare, I want to briefly outline the unifying visual metaphor that we decided to use in the creation of this artwork. For this project, we were consumed with finding new ways of communicating without a shared common language. And so we looked to the natural world for examples of how other minds communicate beyond a spoken language. We settled on the cephalopod as the dominant visual metaphor due to how it communicates through light, color, and pattern fluctuations on the surface of its body. You can see here the visual influence of the cephalopod on both the physical design of the sculpture and also in how we handle the use of light as both an aesthetic and a communicative tool. Briefly, anyWare consists of 3 identical sculptures that exist in 3 different places in the world. In this case, Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa, and are telematically connected, which enables people in each of the locations to interact with each other. The sculptures do the exact same thing at the exact same time, except for the fact that each location has its own location color. So when someone is engaging with the Montreal sculpture, so whenever they touch the object, they're going to see a yellow light. In Toronto, they see blue. In Ottawa, they see pink. But more importantly, whenever anyone in any location sees a blue light, they can understand that someone in Toronto is actually interacting with the sculpture there. This allows people to recognize color as presence and allows for interaction to occur. So each location has a set of rules in the form of a didactic. There's 4 of them, but we made sure to keep the text as text to a minimum so that people could really engage with the objects in front of them. anyWare has 3 art states, each with its own physical and acoustic properties. So on the left here on the slide, you can see the minimal state. In the center slide image, you can see the shadow state, and on the right, you can see the color state. So each state has its own associated game that you had to play in order to transform the sculptures into the next art state. So if you wanted to move the sculpture from the minimal state to the shadow state, you needed to play the tap game. To move from the shadow state to the color state, you needed to play the spin game. And to go from the color state to the minimal state, you need to play the follow game. There is no beginning and no end, and you can jump in at any time and leave the sculptures in any art state for the next set of interactors.
Once we could see the sculptures in their intended context, we observed and could reinforce how successful they were in encouraging intergenerational and intercultural play within a fairly broad range of pre-existing game literacies. This meant several iterations of refining and often greatly simplifying both the physical and the interaction design. From a gameplay perspective, we had to make sure interactions with anyWare worked as machine to human, local, and human to human remote, including all variations of these configurations. It was important to us that if somebody was approaching the sculpture alone, they could interact with it and advance it through all of its art states. But where it really came to life was in multi-user contexts, either with a number of people collaborating on a single sculpture or multiple people engaging remotely with multiple sculptures. Negotiating communication and connection cues between sentient players and the game machine was probably the greatest challenge that we faced. Not only were we teaching an interaction grammar, but doing so on a common interface with entangled machine and human entities. So for example, how do you communicate that a flashing light isn't a glitch, that it's a bloop, something that has meaning? The design was a constant renegotiation of balancing our feedback system, but in a way that fostered and in fact prioritized embodiment and interpersonal connections, which were the goals of the project.
So the handshake was designed to be a point of connection between players and remote locations. So what you're not seeing here, or rather feeling here, is that there's vibrotactile feedback that increases ever so slightly every time there's a new person who's touching the interface. For us, we were super excited by the possibility of enabling people to actually touch each other through the bodies of the sculptures. While it did work on some levels, it didn't have the impact that we'd actually hoped for reasons that maybe we can address during the Q&A. But surprisingly, it was the location lights that triggered the most recognition that there was an individual mind beneath the colorful lights. And at one point during the exhibition, I even went to Ottawa to see how that location was holding up and came across 2 people who were testing out the sculpture. And they were engaged, but they weren't like super focused. However, when somebody from Montreal started to engage and start to interact with the sculpture there was this wild aha moment when it became clear to the interactors that the yellow lights were in fact controlled by another individual. And the excitement and engagement tripled as they began to play with another sentient being. So I think I'm going to leave it here at that point. But before we end our talk, we just want to briefly give thanks to all of the wonderful humans and individuals who helped work with us on this project and made it possible, as well as we have a heartfelt thank you to the SSHRC as well as the Canada Council for funding various aspects of this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Rewa Wright, and I'm here to present a project by myself and Simon Howden called Tactile Potentials, Mixed Reality Project for Live Performance. So this is us. We are two artists from Aotearoa, New Zealand, who live and work in Newcastle, Australia. Simon Howden is a sound designer, digital composer. He's also an installation artist. I'm a media artist, writer, and musician. So we come together to experiment with new techniques in live performance for mixed reality. Our specific method involves utilizing gestural controllers such as the Leap Motion interface with the MIDI Sprout device for sensing the bioelectrical signals from living plants, and we combine those with digital augments that emerge in real time, programmed out of Unity, and then also in our other works we use Touch Designer. This is the second part of our Tactile Potentials project called Contact Zone. It was performed at the end of 2018 in Sydney, Australia, and it featured 44 living plants, a live performer, myself, two Leap Motion interfaces that were connected together to generate augments in real time out of my gestures, but also using the signaling from the plants. Here is the next iteration in the series called Contact Sense. That was a performance at the end of 2019 in Brisbane, Australia, using the digital augments, but also this time combining them with programming in Touch Designer. So that allowed our electrical signals from the plants to be translated as a data visualization using a Touch Designer network. And this is a film that we created out of all of that live performance footage in mixed reality, layered together and focusing also, I suppose, on my dance-like gestures. I'm a New Zealand Māori, so I combine aspects of kapa haka, which is a traditional dance style, with taekwondo, martial art that I practice. And I also, I suppose, experiment with perception in mixed reality. You can see me in this shot looking through the HTC Vive, which has a Leap Motion sensor mounted on the top, and that gives me a form of grayscale vision. So with my vision turned to grayscale, I respond to the visualization generated by the plants. So the idea is that we have a sense of co-composition with the plants. We respond using augments, and they are emitting their signals, which are transposed via MIDI into sound. So there are many ways to assemble plants, data, and bodies. So our method is but one. Please do check out our website, rewawright.com, for more iterations and assemblages with plants, data, and bodies. In terms of our thinking, we're influenced by Karen Berard, the idea that matter is produced and productive, generated and generative, activated processually by its own quantum potential. We like to consider what would happen if we thought of plants like humans existing with a body and sensed from, and accounting for their sensing from within a conditional mode of situated agency. Through our approach to live performance, we examine an iterative method that combines gestural controllers, plants, and augments to produce a multimodal performance in desktop mixed reality using a technical setup that combines the MIDI Sprout interface, Unity 3D, a webcam, living plants, human participants, touch designer, and a bunch of different VSTs and other sound libraries. Of course, we have many influences in this type of work, starting with John Cage's Child of Tree from 1975, his sound piece where he sonified a cactus. Krista Summerer and Laurent Mignonneau's interactive plant growing from 1992, seminal artwork in its field, obviously exemplary in terms of the method it proposed for utilizing signals coming out of plants and combining those with human signals. And of course, there are multiple other plant sensing artworks. Mia Masaoka's performances, such as Pieces with Plants, especially her work with Thomas Zimmerman and the Body Area Networks that they produced. So especially that's a really big touchstone for us. Also Masaoka's way of looking at plants as co-composers, the way that she creates her work alongside them without taking control or dominating. She's always responding to the plants. She's always working with them, not simply using them as instruments, but thinking of them as co-composers. Gregory Lasserre and Anne Den Ank's Kusma Floor, 2007 to the present, of course, a highly influential work in its field with hundreds of iterations. And more recently, Laura Beloff and Jonas Jorgensen's The Condition, 2015 to 2016. Alongside these influences and with our technical method and looking through an interspecies approach proposed by Donna Haraway, I also have my Indigenous thinking coming out of my Maori heritage. We actually have a lot of connections with plants as kind of embodied figures. So for example, one of the hapu or the sub-tribes that I'm a part of, we actually have an ancestor who was actually a giant tree. Okay, and so we approach this tree as if it is the embodiment of a god. So for me, making art with plants, it's really about sensing their electrical signals, you know, thinking about plants as bodies, following, you know, the Indigenous tradition that I'm a part of. Also an influence is Karen Barrad's idea of agential realism and interaction, Deleuze and Guattari's machinic assemblage. So thinking with plants as bodies has involved us as human interlocutors, co-creating with plants as a non-human entity, but also co-creating with data as a non-human entity. So mediating those two forces without, you know, trying to place ourselves in a decentered relationship where we're allowing chance operations to come into it so that we lose a little bit of our human-centered control. So in our performances, both plants and humans are performers as well as the data sources. So I'm going to play a little excerpt from our first Tactile Potentials iteration from the end of 2018. Just a 1-minute excerpt to show you an earlier configuration of this work. Next, we developed Contact Sense. So this was at the end of 2019. It was performed at the SIGGRAPH Asia Art Gallery in Brisbane in November of 2019. So this is an excerpt from a studio rehearsal. You'll see I'm modulating in response to an agave attenuator, using the leap motion and my hand gestures to bring forth digital augments, which you'll see appear on the screen behind me. And also you'll be able to see the view coming out of my HMD. So here's a short excerpt of that piece. Thank you very much, and that concludes our talk for today. If you'd like further information, we have our paper published in the proceeding, and of course our website, rewawright.com.
Hello. First of all, let me say that I'm very happy to be back at ISEA and that I look forward to seeing you all in real time in the Q&A. My name is Joan Soler-Adillon and I work at Universitat Oberta de Catalunya in Barcelona, Catalonia. The paper I'm presenting today discusses the artwork in Pieces VR and its main design challenges and goals. It is a room-scale, VR-based experimental documentary on the personal impact of political prison. It explores the case of the Catalan activists and politicians jailed following the 2017 referendum on independence. The artwork is a 10 to 12 minute VR experience that presents a concentric narrative. There's a starting space with 4 navigation options, each taking the visitor to one of 4 different scenes. After each one, the visitor will be taken back to the start to choose another option. Only after the 4 scenes have been viewed, the visitor will be taken to a final space that shows some contextual information. The experience creates a heavily abstracted series of spaces with wireframe-ish virtual sculptures that become animations and interactive elements through which the user can move around while listening to a very personal accounts of the documented case. A walk on the prison yard, a train ride to Madrid, or the awkwardness of one of the first family visits. The work is built based on 3 main ideas: micronarrative, abstraction, and intimacy. I use the concept of micronarrative in a very similar way in which it is used on game studies, where it is presented as having 3 main characteristics. It is modular, it is accumulative, and it is hierarchical. But I do use it with a significant difference. The microstories in Pieces VR are not hierarchical, since all of them have the same level of importance, and there is no right order to experience them. But they are certainly modular and accumulative. While they afford individual variability, it is by their accumulation that the artwork acquires meaning. VR is often linked to realism and simulation, and frames immersion within these ideas, in combination with the technological devices that allow us to have full sensory isolation from our surroundings. And indeed, VR is a very powerful simulating device, as 360-degree videos also prove. The sense of place is a very powerful notion of such experiences. But just as with the case of animation, in VR there are different paths to follow other than photorealism, and this artwork is among those that explore this path. The approach is to present a world of unfinished figures and barely sketched spaces completely devoid of any realistic context. The idea is to create an experience that leaves plenty of gaps for the user to fill in, hoping that this will help to create a stronger emotional and intellectual link with the piece. VR has become, nowadays, a unique medium in which we can assume that our viewer is fully devoted to our work, even if for a short period of time. There is no second screen in VR. It is, indeed, a perfect context for intimacy, and this is how In Pieces VR aims at using this specificity of the medium, by creating a story that focuses on the personal, the closeness to the person beyond the positive or negative connections that one could have with the larger political context. The working hypothesis here is that this approach can help overcome the obstacles imposed by our regular cultural, political, and media-related filters. Micronarrative and abstraction can work as a means of creating non-fiction VR experiences that depart from conventional immersive journalism and documentary. Whilst this will, quite obviously, not always be the desired approach, they do afford a type of experience that can generate a powerful emotional connection with the story, and aim at overcoming some of our biases when the portrayed case is either alien or politically contrary to our view. Developments in the horizon are to expand the project to incorporate new stories of political repression, always with the view on the personal impact, and to continue exploring storytelling strategies that tell them in a compelling and meaningful way. Before the end, I'll leave you with a video explaining the piece. Thank you very much.
All these people in the train, they don't know I'm going to see my father in prison. Maybe they travel for work, or they are going to see an exhibition. Not our case. Maybe, probably some of them are even happy that we are going through this.
We have 2 hours. This is how much we get every month to pretend that we have a normal family life. It goes on until the prison officer knocks. It is a small room. Well, my cell is about half the size of this, he tells me, and I dare not say that I get claustrophobic in there.
I think about my parents, my sisters, my friends, and all the people who have sent me messages of love, commitment, and tenderness. And most of all, about my beloved and our little one.
One, get ready to leave. 2, walk to the tube station, 5 minutes. 3, take the tube to Sansa station, 10 stops, 30 minutes. 4, walk off the tube to the train platform, 5 to 10 minutes. 5, wait for the train, then wait for it to leave, about 20 minutes at least. You have to get there early. 6, train ride to Madrid, 650 kilometers, 3 hours.
Hello, and welcome to our morning panel or evening, depending on where you're coming from. Thanks so much to all the presenters. My name is Alanna Thain. I'm going to be moderating the discussion for this next about 45 minutes. And I just invite you to add your questions to the chat or to the questions in the discussion board if you have questions for our presenters. I'm a bit of a lag between the two things. We have one question already from the audience that maybe we could start with, and then we can open up the discussion a little bit as well. And the first question here is for Sojung, which asks, what were the findings from measuring the audience's stress level and physical engagement level? And have you found any patterns or any interesting insight?
Thank you for the question, Jung-in. Yeah, it was really interesting kind of findings about for the biofeedback sensor. Actually, I couldn't really find that that's like noticeable insight about like cognitive levels. I think maybe that's like measuring the like sort of stress levels might be more related to subconscious levels. I think that things I have to explore more about that, but more for about the audience physical engagement, I found a very big like differences between genders, especially for like women. Like they tend to like freaking out, and sometimes they turn off the headset or something like that. But a lot of men try to explore more like game. So I think that is very interesting findings. But especially like I think that is really interesting things I want to share about it because of the Bluetooth. The connection sometimes is not really working really well. So sometimes the data should be switched more random sort of generations. And some audiences say that like, oh, it worked really well because I found that like my kind of psychological status, right, reflected on the surface of like color or whatever. But actually it ran randomly because it's just like the system was disconnected or something. So I think they kind of have a bit of ideas or belief when they started to wear the sensor. They start to believe about it's gonna reflect my stress states to the like artwork, even though it was running just like randomly. So that was a bit of like kind of interesting finding, but a little bit frustrating finding at the same times. So I think I have to explore more about that. And also it was really, really different. Before I mentioned about the feedback, how it works, that feedback sensor, how it works, and without mentioning about that. So when I mentioned, people try to more connected their phenomenological states to the artwork, but if I don't mention it, they just kind of forget about it. So that's kind of part what I found that, yeah, it was very interesting sort of observation, but a little bit frustrating at the same time. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe I could jump in with a question that I think is for everybody, and it's a question about the notion of play. Jane and Cindy, you talked about this a little bit in your presentation already, but I would really love to hear more about how you can engage the affordances of play in your work. But I would also just love to hear from Joan and Sojung about this, because I was really struck, Sojung, when you were describing the shift in the Sleeping Eyes artwork to leaving the classroom, and you described it as giving a sense of playfulness. And when you said that, it was a scene that was very terrifying. I had a sort of like, oh my God, what is playfulness in this context, actually? And so I wondered if you guys could talk a little bit about this notion of play and how you engage it in your creative practice.
Cindy?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I was just waiting. I was a little bit of a lag turning my mic on. It's funny. It's funny to think about this, the notion that, you know, of just to kind of tie it into the last comments, things sort of going a little bit wrong, but then having like people kind of reinterpret it and still kind of keep the experience aloft, depending on what they're engaged in. I think that for us anyway, that when that occurred, it was just part of this playful attitude, this playful construct that surrounded the work that I think allowed us to rely on, in a sense, that spirit, not entirely, but in some cases, the spirit of generosity towards having these kinds of engaging encounters. It wasn't something that we could always entirely count on, but I think that just having it structured as being playful gave us an in for, I think, creating. I mean, I like to use play to create more durational interactive experiences, because there's something about the play structure that that kind of keeps experiences aloft for a little bit more than I think you sometimes typically see. So I think having that as kind of the core way in which we wanted somebody to be oriented towards the interaction or to approach the interaction was really important with anyWare, and I think gave us then allowed us to kind of build upon that to create these sorts of connections.
Yeah, I would also like to add to that. I think that one of the playful quality of anyWare actually somehow it gave people, or it created the context where people had a little bit more patience because they were playing and having fun. So they had a little bit of more patience with some of the technical questions that maybe like, I don't quite understand this, but I'm having fun, so I'm going to keep on trying. And so I felt like the play sort of also creates the context for people to want to push through a bit more and to try, just keep on trying.
Cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with this in the kind of work that you've been doing with the sculptures. In my case, in this particular piece, after kind of a long time playing with more collaborative, interactive, playful installations and things like that. In this case, I actually found out that the playfulness and the interactive elements ended up getting in the way of the story in sort of, and of the kind of experience that I wanted to create. Even there was one mechanics of navigation in which people had to knock down something to move from one place to the other, which initially they had to figure out, but once they had figured it out, they would just do it without really looking at the context of what was going on. So it even played against the story. So I ended up reducing and taking away more and more game-like or interactive even elements from the story and keeping it at a very, very low pace from that point of view.
Interesting.
Yeah, so in my cases, I actually use more about the concept of play in the opposite way to bring the frustrations. My whole reason, because I didn't talk more about my academic sort of context due to the time limits, but my general research more about exploring reflexivity in VR. I was a bit critical about the concept of empathy machines, all that. So I just use that sort of sense of playfulness to kind of bring those that uncontrollable experience more about uncontrollable situations and more about frustration. So all kind of alienation, sort of alienation techniques, and try to let people explore that enough, but still kind of found the limitation and frustration and aware about we are still in VR. So kind of try to play with that tension between sort of emergence and sort of alienation. And then I just use those kind of techniques of like gamification and playfulness to provoke those kind of more tensions. Yeah.
Great. I just wonder, Joan, if you could just say a little bit more. I was struck in your presentation when you described how you were trying to kind of create gaps in the experience so that you move into them. And I wonder then how you kind of navigated that sense of creating gaps, which I think of as an invitation to play in certain ways. How did you navigate that? You said you sort of reduced some of the game-like elements, but I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about those opportunities that you built in for the user to enter into the experience.
Okay, yeah. So because also it came a little bit out of the context. This was created when I was in London, and it was about a very particular political case. So what I tried to do with this approach was to create a means of identification. It's not exactly empathy, but a means of connection with the story. The idea being that if you give only very small pieces of the story, and even take away the faces, the names, and any of the context, you as a user, as a visitor, you will have to bring in from your own experience and project from, you see a figure with a child on his or her arms, and you will immediately project someone that you know, or yourself if you have kids, and things like that. And same thing with the stories. There were just little bits and pieces, not much more of what you heard, like 45 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minute stops on each of the scenes. And indeed, this is a little bit what happened from people. Some people visited the piece knowing about the context and all of that, so they had a very different engagement with it. But what I was very interested in was people who were alien or unaware of this political context and how much they would engage with the story through this approach of just leaving a lot of untied ends and things that were unfinished, so they would hopefully project and put into it from their own experience, their own political context, etc. Because at the end, political prison is a very universal topic.
Actually, can I ask you guys questions? Yeah, thank you all. That great presentation. I was very amazed. So I have a question first to Jane and Cindy, and then I was really impressed about the way you guys inspired by the nature, the interaction. So how just kind of so it was fish, right? Sort of that living entities.
Yeah, we were looking at cephalopods. So basically, right. Yeah, like cuttlefish and squid.
Right. It was really kind of that's great. So it was really interesting inside like the interaction from the nature. So is there any kind of interesting findings? Those kind of like what kind of interaction would be different, like sort of living entities, different from like typical human perception and typical human interaction, and how it kind of cooperated in those your artwork. And also because it makes you think about a situation during the pandemics, and then because we lost a lot of interaction and everything, but still we are aware about, we are connected, intertwined with nature like more than before. So it's kind of ironic situation. So, and also how kind of like you guys kind of approach those kind of inside of nature, maybe for the post-pandemic situation. And yeah, maybe we can create some sort of sanctuary or temples, sort of like media art installations for that experience. And also I have a questions to Joanne's, because I think your approach is kind of related to my approach to the VR, a lot of abstraction and disappear the face. And I basically use like Brechtian effect, back to facts, a lot of alienation effect and political kind of like provocation, but a lot of VR technology becoming more hyper realistic these days. And then I think we both of us kind of try to reduce a lot of realistic or hyper realistic kind of details and try to abstract it. And do you have any specific reason? I know like the reason why you kind of use abstraction, but still any political reasons or any kind of try to use those limitations in different way? That's just interesting. And for overall, I also kind of want to ask, like, how can we figure out this pandemic situation about our body, alienations, playfulness, and instead of like, should I just keep online, or is there any another way to pursue with that? Yeah, that's my question.
Should we start at the beginning or the end? Because
sorry, I was just curious about some of the things.
I think you should start with Jane, who I know has given lots of thought to the relationship between the cephalopod and the sculpture.
Yes, this is my obsession. I'm obsessed with, I love nature. I love learning from nature. I think for me, when we rely so heavily on language, and I think that language can be really divisive. It structures how we think, it structures our metaphors, it structures how we conceive of and think of the planet and the world that we're living in and how we interrelate with each other, but which is wonderful. But at the same time, it also can serve as a very dividing force. It can be really divisive in how we deal with the natural world, the naturalized other, how we handle people who come from different cultural backgrounds. I think nature has a lot to teach us. There's a lot of dialoguing in nature that happens non-linguistically, that's based on action and movement and dialoguing through bodies, sort of having symbiotic relationships with each other. And so for me, when Cindy and I talked about how we would handle the games and technologies, one of the things that we wanted to stay away from was screens in particular, and we wanted to stay away from, you know, headphones with people talking and coordinating attacks and actions. We wanted to find ways to ask people to be in the world, to be different in the world, and to engage with each other differently, and to, you know, let our actions speak louder than our words. We wanted to cross cultural and linguistic divides in particular. And so the cephalopod I find an extraordinarily amazing, it's one of my favorite, like, it's just, I adore this wonderful, smart creature that is very complex and has complex behaviors, that learns, that can move through the world and problem solve. And it communicates through patterns and textures and light fluctuations, which is exactly what we were trying to do with anyWare. So I felt that was an appropriate metaphor, and so then I just based everything visually on the cephalopod. And, you know, Cindy and I spent a lot of time trying to think about how can we get people to stop relying, you know, exclusively on vision and language, and how can we start to help people start to translate action as intentionality, and to see the movement, or the movement of lights and patterns and texture and patterns and color fluctuations as actual intelligent action. And how can we sort of guide that interpretation of this visual phenomenon? I don't know if Cindy wants to add anything to that.
I mean, just really quickly, I think one of the things that when Joan was talking about the you know, removing game-like elements, I think that's part of our process too, was thinking about ways, particularly in trying to avoid having verbal communication, and then all of the ways in which we kind of coordinate and connect by default through that. There was one game that was really inspiring on that front was Journey by that game company, which explicitly removes these sorts of, you know, the ability for you to kind of talk with somebody remotely, so that you are kind of retuned towards communicating through physical sort of ways. So we wanted to kind of aim to do something like that, to kind of do that reorientation, that retuning towards communicating through light and sound and touch, as opposed to saying, oh wait, you're supposed to be doing this, you're supposed to be doing that, that I think creates a different, it just puts people in a different sort of kind of relationality that I think has more of that I don't want to say natural, but more of that almost animal quality to it. I think sort of brings us a little bit closer to thinking about how we communicate with non-humans.
Thank you.
In a sense, it's a way of like retraining, you know, how to be in the world in a different way. You know, that's more physical, and it's not so reliant on this human sort of form of communication.
Yeah, it sounds like this would be very interesting also to test in a multicultural environment in which people don't necessarily speak the same language, and see how they develop the communication in here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in terms of the, no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that that's why we set up our the anyWare sculptures in Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto, because of the French-English sort of difference. We wanted to specifically address that, and ideally, we wanted to actually have it in different countries in Europe. And I tried very hard. I had many different options, but nothing was able to coordinate, because it has to happen at the exact same time for this to work, and it was hard to coordinate different galleries in different countries to be willing to do this at the exact same time. But yeah, that's specifically what I was interested in.
Cool. So in the terms of your other questions, Sojung, and thank you for them and your comments. I agree with there are things that are similar between our approach to VR. About the step away from realism, there is a political reason for it in that case in particular, but also in general to talk about this kind of topics. I think the approach was we are sort of educated to ignore certain things that happen to people that we are not connected to culturally. Let's say, think about Europe and how the reactions when something happens in Paris or something happens in Bangladesh or anywhere else in the world. So by seeing more and more of these on TV, we end up just not reacting to some of these things. So by removing the names, the faces, the context, the idea was to go to the very core of the story and see if there could be a different reaction there. And also there is an aesthetic approach, I guess, looking for what can be specific of VR beyond realism, which, I mean, it's interesting in some contexts. I don't think it's particularly necessarily interesting in terms of storytelling. So we can create very powerful experiences that depart from realism, that have nothing to do with it. And what you said about the pandemic, it's interesting because all of the works that were presented in this panel, the 4 of them actually, are under threat right now with the pandemic. And how do you do VR anymore? How do you do something in which people have to touch? How do we deal with these things?
It's interesting because I actually feel that anyWare is perfect for the pandemic because I made every touch point out of silicone. So it's really easy to sterilize the piece. And I did that on purpose because I remember working on a game, a physical game in Vienna, and we had an interface that was purple and fuzzy, or this wasn't in Vienna, sorry, this was in Montreal. It was purple and fuzzy. And by the end of the day, it was brown and fuzzy. And I was just so disgusted by it. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to even look at it. And so from that moment on, anything that people touch, I made rubber and easy to sterilize. And so anyWare, as long as people are willing to sterilize it, I mean, it can allow people to have embodied interactions with each other through space and time. So that was kind of the goal.
Of course, if it wasn't,
but I agree.
It is trapped in a gallery right now, but
the
last place it was before lockdown, it's still there.
Yeah, but in a box.
Okay, well, yeah, a little bit better. But anyway, the other thing I wanted to add to that too, in relation to the pandemic, that I think ties in all of the pieces that are on this panel, is that, I mean, one of the, because we've all been now so habituated to doing everything remotely, that I don't know. I find these works really just really becoming increasingly important. Like trying to think about, we can see what we don't get when we are just networked, and we're envisioning that as connecting to minds or to imaginations. But meanwhile, we have these physical living bodies that we're used to engaging in these kind of social exchanges that that we don't have as readily incorporated into these sorts of technologies. So I think that every piece here asks, I think, important questions about, or highlights important things about what those other pieces, what's missing from that overall. What aren't we doing with networking?
Yeah.
So you guys have already started to answer this question from the chat, which is precisely about how the pandemic will affect interaction and playfulness and how you might adapt artworks. But I maybe just want to build on Pablo's question a little bit to ask a question about kind of distance and intimacy. And so again, what are the kind of strategies that you're using that aren't simply about kind of collapsing or filling in the kind of gaps that might occur, but that move in some cases laterally, like Cindy and Jane, about your use of light, which both kind of, it's obviously visual, but it also moves away from the visual, and that it activates the body in kind of different ways. And so thinking about some of the ways that you might actually retain, in a certain sense, some kind of distance in your work rather than just kind of collapsing it. Or so Jung, I was thinking about your realization that you couldn't simply put yourself in the shoes of someone with narcolepsy as the most effective way to convey that feeling. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about distance as a form of intimacy in a certain way in some of the works that you're doing.
Just you mean like just distance and intimacy, the levels? Right. So I think in terms of empathies, I think you mean specifically for the pandemic situation or general intimacies or distancing?
I think
or
kind
maybe
of more generally, I'm interested.
More generally, yes.
See, for example, about how possessiveness is actually a form of power. And so thinking about, what are these modes of engagement that retain in some ways certain kind of qualities of not just possessiveness or capture.
Right, because I think I'm more interested it's about the concept of meta-awareness, because when we see something more like objectively or more like broadly, we need this distancing, we need the distance. So my whole research more about break the simple immersion and provoke awareness and distance to critically think about that. So we never really understand narcoleptic situations and we never become the other. Like we never really grasp the other. But what we can do, we put the positions and then we all aware this is just my sensation and my feelings, and then just aware the distance. Because the danger of VR, they just try to reduce the differences and then give us the illusion this is like first person point of view, and then we put like identification and everything. But simply put on the headset and identify with other perception is not empathy at all. So I think I just maybe the first steps, we need to wear up the distance, and then actually we can convert the distance to build that like better intimacies, and then accept the limitation of understanding, and then we kind of aware of ourselves and others and the broad levels, I think, and then it kind of give us a bit of a sense of more meta awareness. So I think it's more about extension of ourselves, extension of our like experience, rather than just like dualism between intimacy or distance. So I just wanted to transcend then the duality of intimacies and distance, and just like provoke more of a meta awareness. I think that was more my like exploration, and then it's kind of like challenging in a way. But I think the pandemic is very, very frustrating for me about the level of intimacy, level of disembodiment, because even kind of try to provoke that sort of frustration, I need to put something in and then kind of break the illusion or break the like immersion. That works. But even if I just try to do the virtual exhibition and convert it all different ways of experience, it won't work, because of the medium specificity of the VR is always kind of bring the tensions of the physical and virtual world, and always duality of embodiment, duality of presence. I think that is the like medium specificities of VR. I think that is kind of fundamentally brings the question of distance and intimacy. So I think using not VR and doing a VR work, actually this is not really, it doesn't really work for me, to be honest. It's not intimacy, it's not distance at all.
Interesting. Does anyone else want to comment on that, Jane?
Well, I was actually interpreting the words a little bit differently, thinking about distance being physical distance, being away from each other, and intimacies. And I mean, I think it's such a challenge. And I mean, this is something that Cindy and I were thinking about, like technology has been built in a very particular way, which ignores a lot of the body. And we sort of place intimacy, I think, in proximity to the body and touching and identifying. But we can be intimate, I think, in with the mind. But then when it comes to this physicality and this sense of presence, and also with technology, they're so closely related to, like, especially this type of technology, like surveillance, and that's not intimacy. That's the opposite of intimacy. And I think about like stuff like the good night lamps. So these lamps that you have in your house, and when you come home, you have a master lamp, and then you have other smaller lamps that are interconnected. And when people come home, they turn on their lamp, and you can see all the light lamps come on. So then you at a distance are like, okay, so my loved one who's living in X country is now at home, and so now I can feel intimately connected to that person. And so that light serves as sort of a beacon. But then, you know, you tell that same story to somebody else, and they're like, well, you know, my parents could maybe use that as a way of finding out when I'm at home and when I'm not at home. So there's also that side to it as well. And I think that it's really hard for intimacy to emerge in this sort of weird surveillance culture. And then how do you, I don't know, I don't really have a formed thought on it. It's just something that I find really complicated and very entangled, because these technologies are used in such a particular way. And how do we reinvent not only the technologies, but also how we think about these technologies, and how do we protect our, you know, privacy with these technologies? And I don't know, it's just such an interesting question.
Yeah, I think as artists, we are always working against the technology in a way. It's technology that's designed for something else, something completely different, and we have to deal with all of these contradictions. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a way to approach this idea of intimacy and distance, which is really nicely illustrated with Chaine in this work, in that the game as the element to break the distance is what happens with two kids that meet for the first time. Probably that, if anything, that what they will end up doing is playing, and this play is what can create this intimacy. And then maybe the next step is the VR headset and the closeness to the story and all of that. But I think there's something in there that you are kind of already working towards.
I wonder if we could take another question from the audience. I think it's a really interesting question. I put it in our chat so everyone can see it. Do you subscribe to the idea that we have a certain amount of emotional capital, and that this, combined with the pandemic, complicates the social function of art?
So I've been looking at this question, and I've been trying to figure out the best way to approach it, or to think about it. I mean, I think that one that one, I guess, then presumption with, I think that the question is sort of is maybe dancing around a presumption that there's really just, we're emotionally drained and there's no space for art in the land of the emotionally drained, but then has which is not necessarily untrue. I'm sure that there's tons of things that we're not doing because we don't have, because we're just our capacity is necessarily directed towards other sorts of things. One thing that did strike me as a little bit of an off note with it is this sort of underlying sense then that art is really for people who have that privilege and that excess of capacity, which I don't think is true. And I think it's something that has been, that art remains a powerful force in the kind of the life world of people who aren't necessarily just not otherwise emotionally drained, and in fact that it's the thing that does the refilling when you're drained. So anyway, this is also an unformed thought, but that was sort of my first reaction.
Yeah, it's difficult though. I mean, we're just sort of, we're used to coming across art in environments that aren't, well, intimate. I mean, weird, actually, just to think about that. I mean, we're in public spaces, we're in the white cube, we're, you know, we put on headsets, we're in this sort of very public environment, and all of a sudden now we're in this very intimate environment, and it's just a different way of receiving. And I wonder how much of the social is sort of built into our experience of art. And so now we're just sort of faced with a different paradigm of how we meet up with it, maybe.
I think pandemic make us think about more about what we were missing, rather than like, I think we need to just like try to not replicate it what we experience in the physical level. Just try to converting everything to the online virtual. I think it would not work. But maybe we might need to think about a different way of presenting the work, and then maybe we were too obsessed about just technology, and then maybe blockchain and AI, and you know, on all the physical like complicated interaction. But now we are like, those things are impossible to do it. Like maybe it will be possible, but it's really challenging. So maybe it's kind of better, like more reflect and slow down to think about it, what we were missing, and then think about how we can complement all that things rather than replicating, or rather than just like mimicking like what we could do in the physical spaces. I think that's the point. And also I was thinking about maybe we could create some sort of like a temples, but not really like religious way, just temple or sanctuary for the one person, for example. And I think media art can kind of give us insight about the way we interact with technology, the way we interact mediated through the technology. But maybe I think media art kind of can have a potential to do it. So I think I hope I could make some sort of like one person temple and invite it to experience some sort of VR or media art installation. I think this is more about a different way of thinking.
Yeah, I would agree. It's an opportunity to really approach things differently. I think I'm teaching a class and I was designing everything. And at one point I was like, wait a minute, this is based on the fact that I was delivering this in person. So wait a minute, let me just shift everything. Like all the rules can be broken at this point. And like, what's the best way to deliver this content given the new constraints? It's an interesting design question, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's at the same time is that there's the tension of not giving up with everything else and not switching everything to online. And you know, should we keep doing these things that we want to do, hoping that someone will be able to clean it up and at least and somehow do it still.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in something that you're all saying, there's a tension that also kind of emerges, maybe a really productive tension between the social and the collective. And that part of what we're experiencing now is a kind of a certain force of the collective, human and non-human, rearranging our habits and experiences that are making us pose different questions about what do we want from the social? What do we expect from the social as well? That I also see as something that you're working with in all your pieces too. We have another question from the chat, which is in regards to VR and journalism and VR and narrative. Can you talk about VR in terms of narrative, how the narrative is transformed between the journalist, the story, and the interactor? And I don't know if Joan, you want to tackle this one first, since you were talking a little bit about narrative and micro-narrative in your work.
Yeah. First of all, there are many things in VR and journalism that have been doing with 360 video, and it's good always to differentiate 360 video than VR, which means synthetic images and creation. But there's, I think, mainly in terms of narrative and from this more journalistic point of view, the phrase that you always hear is the idea of the story being as opposite of storytelling. So meaning that in VR, it's more about you are in the story. The experience will usually try to make you feel like you're in the place and have a very different approach to it by either being able to look at different things from within or just to be able to do a little bit more of interaction. The idea of the actor also is very interesting, because in actually many of the journalistic VR stories, if based on video, they are usually not really interactive, might be on being able to look at a different place. So there's a sort of a rethinking of the whole thing. When I was working on this project, I found super interesting to think about how in a medium in which your visitor can look anywhere in the 360 degrees, you are actually, through the story, through how you design the sound, through how you put up the images in the space, you are directing the gaze of the visitor, and most of the time you know where people are going to be looking at, even without just having one thing on one place, and that's obviously where they're going to look. So you can work through these things very interestingly, and it's a whole different story than working with a flat screen, I would say.
So June, did you want to talk to this question a little bit as well?
I think my answer might be similar from to what I've answered before, because it's more about the reflexivities. Because what VR can bring to us is more about our sense of physical engagement and our thoughts. And the interesting thing is, even if we are in the VR and then all the VR technology is rapidly, growing or something, our body is still missing, and then we don't really bring our body. We can't see our body, and then there's always certain alienation, always certain disconnection, and then we have to fill the gaps, and then we have to wait about how my bodies interact with that, and then where is my body in it, and all that kind of filling the gaps make us more think about it, those kind of social issues, and also journalistic point of view or something like that. So I think the journalists might need to design the VR like journalisms in a way we can, like, interactor can find their own ways of thinking, own way of reflecting about the social levels. Maybe the 360 journalism might be a bit different, but if it's just like real-time interactive, like immersive journalisms, I think the most important thing is that rather than just like all of a convinced or story about realistic story, is more about I try to reflect about those kind of social situations, and then how I can figure out and just fill in the gaps between my experience and those kind of social experience. Yeah.
Well, we have about 2 minutes left, and we have one last question from the audience, which is the difference between working with AR and VR. If anyone wants to dive in our waning moments.
Well, I haven't really worked in AR, but I think the main difference is we can think of AR as a layer of images or of data on top of what we see of the real world, whilst in VR you are able to create your own worlds, and you're completely away from the immersed on it. That's what the idea of having the user completely for yourself in a way, which is, I think, one of the very interesting things of VR. That it has very negative things, but this is one of the best.
I think just very simple answer for me is kind of similar. I think like a AR is like a 2.5D and the VR is like a 3D for my perception, like Photoshops. Yeah.
Jane and Cindy, do you guys want to say anything about this?
Well, for us, we can't really. I mean, we can comment on the differences between VR and the actual world. Like that's just sort of an AR. I mean, it's sort of. I mean, there are some. I mean, it's interesting to even think about what are the differences between AR and something like Jane and I are doing, which is essentially networking physical environments. And I think it's just. I mean, like we've already said, this difference between working within something that's on the inside and something that is spilling out onto the outside. So, we're not crafting a controlled environment in which we're situating somebody. We're out in the messy sort of physical world, and we're kind of spilling outward into that and trying to bring elements of these design networked interactions out into a physical space. And in some cases that gives us these very hard material constraints on what is and what isn't going to happen. I mean, I work in VR as well, and I do have to say that there is one affordance of working in VR environments is that absolute control, relatively speaking, as opposed to working in kind of physical installation contexts where if a sensor can go wrong, it's going to go wrong, and if somebody's going to trip over something and all of a sudden destroy an entire thing that took 3 hours to set up, then that's going to happen. That those types of epic failures don't happen as much in VR, but then there's also something I think that's really that's really compelling about the physicality of those sorts of networked experiences. We don't have to. Jane and I didn't have to worry necessarily about trying to explicitly create kinds of connections related to physicality or embodiment. We had to worry about how we designed them. But everybody coming into the work, particularly because you're dealing with these large sculptures, or they're coming in with a physical body. So designing how that worked and what we and what the range of possibilities were with those physical bodies. That was the domain that we were working in, but say highlighting or drawing people's attention to the fact that they're embodied to some extent was there. Like, it's not something that we crafted in the same way that we craft it in VR.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're out of time. There's one more question from the chat, which I think we can keep and recuperate. But I first of all just want to thank all of our presenters and our panelists so much. I'm sorry you can't hear applause, but we very much appreciate your sharing your work with us here today. And thanks also to the great questions and the comments in the chat as well. And I believe you can stay on for a networking break at this point if you want to have a chance to connect and meet other people over the course of the conference. So thanks so much and have a great ISEA.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
it was
you.
really nice
Thank you.
hearing about everyone.
Thank you.
Stay safe. See you.